living as we do now in the age of the internet and smartphones, we're more than ever bombarded with everything except where we are and what we're doing. We're constantly distracted to the point where we've become quite oblivious to who we're sitting next to, what's going on around us, even how we feel in our own bodies. We're just totally distracted. And so perhaps the Camino exerts a stronger draw on us in the last couple of decades because it offers us a relief from that. It offers us a sense of quietness and a chance to hear ourselves think. And that, for many of us, is a new experience.
Welcome back to the 10 Adventures podcast. We talk so often about great adventures and destinations, but not too often do we dig into the history of these places. So today we're going to change things up and talk about the history of one of the most popular walking trips on Earth, the Camino de Santiago. Here to share the history is Eva Schubert, host of the Villains and Virgins podcast, as well as a great YouTube channel. Hi, Eva. Welcome to the show.
Hi, Richard. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
I'm super excited about learning about this because even though I know about the pilgrimage, like the route and the details and all like the stuff to actually walk it, I don't know a bunch. I almost don't know almost nothing about the history. And so it's going to be like going back to university for a lecture day. I'm super excited. But before we go and learn all about the history, can you share a little bit about yourself and how you became a successful creator and what you talk about on your history channel, Villains and Virgins?
Well, the answer is I've been a history nerd my entire life. So reading books, it started with historical fiction when I was in my early teens and fairly quickly got straight into history and biographies of famous people like Julius Caesar and Cleopatra and this sort of thing. And I became completely obsessed with the Tudors in my early teens and just read absolutely everything I could find on them, historically speaking. So I've always had a pretty strong appetite for history. And it was only natural that I would go and study it at university for my first degree. And fast forward, I mean, I became a college instructor. I am in academia all the time. And in academia, you need to teach what there's a demand for. So I found that my passion for history, I got to bring that into the classroom sometimes, but very often they wanted me to teach other things like, research and citation and this kind of thing. So the podcast began in 2020, actually, during the pandemic, as many of us were at home with more time on our hands than we were used to. And for me, it was an exercise in focusing my mind on something that was going to be engaging, something that I was passionate about. And it started as a hobby, really. I would just put out episodes or series as I got involved in reading about them, but not on a regular basis. And that's changed more recently. And so the podcast is now a full-time regular sort of engagement that I do all the time. And I absolutely love it. So Villains and Virgins podcast is a history podcast, but it's very much an emphasis on narrative history. It's about the people. It's about the experience. I really deplore the approach to history that's just a bunch of names, dates, facts, treaties, and concepts. And unfortunately, that's how most people experience history in the classroom. And that is not how we do it on the podcast.
It sounds, a beautiful way to approach history and just make it so much more relatable because it is super interesting to learn about what happened in the past. If you're not just trying to remember, okay, 1852 is this, 1853 was that, here's this guy, here's that guy. You had a great episode on the Camino, and I was wondering, how did you get interested in the Camino de Santiago?
So the Camino was something that had come up occasionally in reading and occasionally in anecdotes. It really started with me hearing other people talking about having gone on this pilgrimage. And I had a basic concept of what pilgrimage was, historically speaking. And so I had a framework to understand it, but I wasn't really familiar with the route or how it had started or anything like that. I ended up doing the pilgrimage in April and not the entire route because some of your listeners may know, it's hundreds of kilometers long, some of the routes you can take. I only had time for about 300 kilometers of it, was the window of time that was available. So that's what I did. And before doing that, I started doing some homework on the history of this experience and how it started and what it was about. And that became a consuming interest. So by the time I came home, I had so many other rabbit holes and things I wanted to learn more about. And these culminated in me doing a full episode on the podcast on the Camino de Santiago and medieval pilgrimage in general, which is a much larger picture because the Camino is only one of several major routes that people have been traveling for centuries.
So I'm interested, how did the Camino de Santiago first emerge as a major pilgrimage route? And like, why was Santiago de Compostela chosen as the end destination?
That's a really interesting story, and it's one that has a lot of legends wrapped up around it. There are many versions of this, but what we know for certain is that the pilgrimage starts up in the early ninth century, so about the 810s. That's what we're talking about. And it begins because a hermit claims to have found the remains of St. James. And when we say St. James, the one we're talking about in this case is James the Apostle, one of the original 12 apostles in Christianity. So one of Jesus' closest companions, one of the eyewitness people who walked with him in his life. So that James, there are other James in the canon and the tradition, but the original James. And so allegedly his bones or his remains were found in Galicia, in sort of Western Spain. And a shrine is built there to recognize his bones and those of his followers who brought them there. And then they build a church over that. And the city of Santiago de Compostela grows up around that shrine. So immediately, once the bones of someone with such an elevated profile in Christianity are discovered in Spain, people begin to travel to visit the bones. And this is part of a much older tradition of relics in medieval Christianity. And the idea is that by visiting the bones or the remains of a saint, you could derive some direct spiritual benefit from that. So it becomes an act of piety and devotion, and people are already making pilgrimages to other places, often to smaller shrines to visit the bones of other martyrs or saints. And so now that this very major apostle's remains are found in Spain, it becomes a huge reason for people to make that journey.
For a medieval Christian, was this something that people, at that point in time were traveling all across Europe, or was it mostly people who were already in kind of northern Spain who were going to Compostela?
So initially, of course, people who are closer, who are in Spain are some of the first to make the journey because it's right in their neighborhood essentially. But very quickly word travels. And we know that even as far away as what we now call Germany, Charlemagne, who lives in the 800s, is commenting on this pilgrimage and worrying about the idea of people who have been condemned as criminals being sentenced to go on the pilgrimage as part of their punishment. There were many reasons that people went. But to go back to your original question, yes, very quickly people from across Europe are coming. People from as far east as Hungary are coming. People from England and France are coming, from Portugal. So it's very much all over Western Europe. And we even have some fascinating evidence that Muslim travelers from farther afield even visited Compostela on their way through to kind of get a look at what was this big Christian shrine and pilgrimage spectacle going on here. So it becomes a major draw.
You talk a bit about, there's a little bit of penance. Sounds like there's a lot of kind of devotion aspect. Is part of it also like the adventure aspect, do you think? Like, were people just saying, hey, it sounds fun just to go and spend months, 6 months walking to Spain and back? Like, that's a fun, interesting life experience.
Oh, absolutely. And so to break down the reasons that people go on pilgrimage, there are sort of a number of them. One of them is, we'll call it the spiritual benefit department. Okay. And this can be because you feel the need to do penance for some bad things you've done, even possibly some very bad things you've done, or you're worried about decreasing the amount of guilt that you're going to die with and the potential punishment in the afterlife that you might still have to pay before you can go to heaven. There's this idea of purgatory. in the medieval Christian tradition. So even if you're not going to hell, you're probably going to have some sin on your spiritual bank account that needs to be dealt with before you can go through the pearly gates, and that's called purgatory. So people are really worried about how much time they have to spend in purgatory because it's very similar to hell. It's got all the flames and terrible things. You just don't have to stay there for eternity. You have to stay there for a variable amount of time, depending on how much bad stuff is on your ledger. So, one reason for going on pilgrimage is to reduce that moral debt, if you like. And fascinatingly, you could be commissioned or requested to go and do a pilgrimage on behalf of somebody else. So, we have these incidences of people who are dying who say, I wanted to do this pilgrimage, but I'm now unable to. Can you carry out this vow on my behalf? Walk the Camino for me so that I can have the spiritual benefit of your journey. And even pilgrims being paid, like commissioned. So the patron would fund the pilgrim with the necessities of travel. The pilgrim would walk the journey, but in this case, the spiritual benefit of that journey would be transferred to the patron. So that's the spiritual benefit category. Number two is the request for help. And a lot of times, if people were sick or they had injuries or they had family problems or things that they just couldn't solve, the idea that if you would make a pilgrimage to the shrine of the saint and you would pray there about whatever it was, your arthritis, your rebellious son, etc., that the saint might intercede on your behalf and that your prayers could be answered. So that's a category. And the third category is definitely adventure. It's sort of a socially sanctioned way of leaving behind all of your responsibilities and the work and the schedule of your everyday life and going somewhere you've probably never been, journeying for, in many cases, months, because most people are doing this on foot. And they're doing this for months. I mean, if you're traveling from England and you're going to go to Western Spain, it's going to take you months. And by the way, once you get to Santiago, you don't get to get on an airplane and fly home. You got to turn around and walk all the way back. So it's going to be a long time that you're away from home and you're traveling through these different places and meeting people on the road and in the towns you go into. And so there's definitely a significant component of travelers that are doing it for that reason. And of course, they get criticized by some spiritual moralizers as well, saying these are not the right reasons for going on pilgrimage. We need to cut down on these merrymaking pilgrims who are going because they want to meet people and have chats on the road when they should be really worried about purgatory. So this is criticized even at the time.
The dangers now doing a pilgrimage are often blisters and strained muscles. What were the dangers and hardships for medieval pilgrims?
Oh, far more significant. One of the major risks you would run is being robbed, basically having brigands show up somewhere along the road and threaten you with violence or death if you didn't hand over your money. And then it's not as though you should be carrying a lot of money, but you were going to be carrying money for your needs on the road and probably for buying little souvenirs at saints' shrines along the way that you were going to visit, and for maybe making a donation at the cathedral itself, which is a very common thing that pilgrims would do. And so the biggest risk probably was theft. That's the one that's most frequently reported. And then there are other things like being cheated or extorted in some of the towns that you went into, people overcharging you for things, or promising you, oh, come to this house and we'll give you a good dinner and a place to sleep and good wine, but then it's really garbage wine and the food is awful, but you paid already and it's quite expensive. So, things like that.
Thinking back, going back over 1,000 years, um, there wasn't as much diversity of people traveling around, or at least my assumption is. And did the Camino influence the development of trade or travel or even culture, bringing all these people from across Europe and farther away through these parts of northern Spain?
I think it's inevitable that it did. And I was just looking at the life of a guy called William the Ninth of Aquitaine, who's this very powerful duke. in southern France, which borders northern Spain. And 3 of the routes that people take to do the Camino run through this part of southern France. And he himself made the pilgrimage, as did many people from his region. But they're looking at a stream of travelers who are coming from outside southern France, from potentially north or east, coming through southern France, going into Spain, and then coming back out. And so these people are bringing with them things from wherever they come from. They're going into Spain, they're being exposed to what's in Spain. And by the way, Spain in the 800s, 900s, 1100s had a very significant Muslim presence. I mean, there were Muslims in Spain for some 700 years, from about the 700s to the end of the 1400s. And with that kind of a long-standing presence, you have food that is coming from in North African traditions and cultures. You have fashion, you have music. And even if you were not Muslim, if you were going to be journeying into Spain at that time, even just through Christian communities, these are communities that have Muslim neighbors and Muslim influence and are exposed to this architectural, culinary, fashion fusion. And so people who are going into Spain at that time would also have had that experience. And one of the things that I saw actually when I did the pilgrimage, went into one of the museums on the route, and they had reliquary boxes. Now, a reliquary is a box or a container designed to protect the bones or remains of someone holy. And usually the reliquaries themselves are supposed to be very beautiful because you're not going to be opening it up and displaying the bones most of the time. That was actually a risk that people might steal them. So the bones are locked in some beautiful casket or case, and that's the jeweled case that sits in the shrine, and you get to see it from a distance, and it's supposed to be beautiful to look at. And many of these reliquaries were actually precious boxes and things of Muslim manufacture. Like they had a very distinctly North African design because they were purchased or traded from people from the various communities in Spain at the time, some of whom had those influences. And so now you have a very North African looking box with ivory and silver in these geometric designs that is housing a Christian relic. And people are exposed to that. They're looking at that and they're taking these ideas back into architecture and art in their places of origin. So we know that there is architecture in southern France, which is influenced by architecture they'd seen in this fusion period of Spanish history. So yes,
What role did monasteries, hospitals, and religious orders play in supporting pilgrims if we, go back 1,000 years?
that's a very significant role. In fact, the pilgrimage itself is primarily made possible by charitable donations. So sometimes the king or queen in Spain or a nobleman would make a donation for the sustenance of the pilgrimage route, but that donation would be made to the church, to monasteries, and so on. Basically, the pilgrimage amenities, like where are you going to sleep, was very often in a monastery or even in the larger complex around a church. This is not the case anymore as much because we have these little pilgrim hostels that are set up. But many of those early pilgrim hostels and sleeping spaces were organized by churches along the way. And the medical care too. I mean, if you became sick, very ill on that pilgrimage and you needed medical care, you were probably heading into a local monastery where there would be people there who were part of that religious order who were going to be looking after you. So the monasteries and churches played an enormous role. They're basically logistical support along the route, and pilgrims had extremely regular contact with them. Without that system, the pilgrimage would have been impossible, I think.
Thinking about, the costs and the time associated with the pilgrimage, could average people actually do this? Like, would it just be one member of a family that would step away, or would like a husband and wife just say, okay, we're not going to do our farming for a year and we're going to go walk to Compostela and back? Like it seems much harder in the past than it is today. What was it actually like?
So, of course, it would depend on who you were. I mean, if you were a noble, if you were from a wealthy aristocratic family, then you could afford to have multiple family members make the journey, and that would be no problem because you had servants and you had income. If you were from a small farming community, that would obviously be a much more daunting prospect. People did, but you would often be in the position of maybe getting sponsored by people in your community that there's going to be an agreement that other people will help look after your fields while you're gone. They're going to contribute a little bit to your travel expenses. Sort of the community of your church would send you, and you would go and you'd make prayers on behalf of the community as well, sort of as a representative. Or you could be commissioned. If you were a poorer person, you could be commissioned by a wealthier person to go just on their behalf. So it was a significant financial commitment, and it did involve being away from home for months at a time. And there was always the possibility that you might not come back. You might actually die on the road, either because you were robbed and beaten or because you got sick or injured and succumbed. And there are many stories of that happening as well. So it was definitely a significant undertaking. People made their wills commonly if they were leaving from a village going off on the pilgrimage because they knew that there were these risks. And yet there were systems where lower class people, people who weren't wealthy, made those journeys as well.
Did the pilgrimage contribute to the development of key towns along the way? And if so, how did it influence how those towns developed?
Undoubtedly, yes. So, for example, some towns grew up along the road because there were going to be a regular traffic of pilgrims coming through there. Pilgrims who are going to need to eat, and pilgrims who may need, other things, including souvenirs. And this continues to this day. But in many cases, you might start with something like a hospital. Uh, and it's not as though towns are necessarily emerging where there weren't any. It's more about towns increasing in size because of the pilgrim traffic and maybe expanding. Because once you have these routes, their pilgrims are going to places where there are churches and monasteries, right? Those are existing structures that initially served just their local community, and now they're serving this influx of outsiders who are coming through. So it's more about an expansion of existing facilities in most cases rather than the establishing of entirely new communities, although I'm sure that happens in some places. But in a lot of places, it's about sort of expanding business, expanding facilities to accommodate this regular influx of people now.
The Camino declined in importance after the Middle Aged. Why did it decline in importance?
It nearly disappeared, actually. By the time we get to the 1970s, there's a mere handful of people, I think less than 10, that are registered to do the Camino in the entire year. So we came within a hair's breadth of it disappearing from memory altogether. So the question is why? There are a number of factors. Two of the most significant that I think most people will readily understand are the Black Death and the Protestant Reformation. So the Black Death really takes off in a major way in Europe in the 14th century, so the 1300s. And this absolutely decimates the population on a scale that is extremely difficult for you or I to imagine. The numbers we're looking at are sometimes like, a third of the population in some areas, entire communities disappearing, entire ways, universities being shut down for years. It was just, I mean, if you take COVID and you multiply it by 1,000 in terms of the lifestyle change and so many people that you knew actually being dead, it changed Europe in ways that we can only try to imagine. So that had a major impact on people traveling, as you can imagine, right? Because you're afraid of dying in your community. You're not going to go traveling some distance and expose yourself to unknown other people who could infect you with this virus and kill you. So the Black Death has a very significant effect. And then it's followed by the Protestant Reformation, which kicks off in the early 1500s. And why that is significant is that the Protestant reformers had a very different view of Christianity than the medieval version. The medieval version had this idea of purgatory and penance, and the idea that going and visiting the bones of a saint could benefit you spiritually, both now and in the hereafter. The reformers under Martin Luther and company come out with a very different version. They say, actually, it's really just you and God and the grace that God may have for you. There's not much that you can do. Going on a pilgrimage, getting blistered feet and walking barefoot for miles, that's not going to have a lot of weight on your spiritual fate. And these bones, a lot of them aren't even bones of people. A lot of these are fake. These are not actually remains of saints. And even if they were, they can't help you. And so there's this backlash against relics, against the whole version of the afterlife and the actions you were supposed to do now that were going to help you. And the reforms that the Protestants bring in sweep a lot of that away. They empty many monasteries. People leave from monastic life. Monks and nuns abandon that. There's a whole scale revision of what many people believe Christianity looks like and what it requires. And there's people like Erasmus, who's not a Protestant reformer, but he is a humanist who thinks that the existing church structure needs to be reformed. And Erasmus is on record as saying things like, these pilgrims go and they come back with all these worthless pewter trinkets, these pilgrim badge souvenirs, and they think they've done something useful, but it's just a waste of time and money. And, there's a very strong criticism of the whole idea. And so that obviously has a major dent on pilgrimage, not amongst the people who remain Catholic Christians, but certainly for anyone who embraces the Protestant reform idea of Christianity. And then, I mean, those are just the biggest factors. It's not the only ones, but the two single largest. And so it basically dwindles and dwindles and dwindles and nearly disappears. It's really to the efforts of one particular scholar and priest in Spain that we owe the resurgence of the Camino, which happens very recently.
I'm interested in what sparked the modern revival. You said you went down to 10 pilgrims in the 70s. How did it come back to hundreds of thousands now in the 2020s?
So there's this amazing Spanish priest, and I believe his name is Father Elias San Pedro. And he began by doing his PhD work on the history of the Camino in Spain. But he didn't keep it just academic. He then devoted the rest of his life to bringing the Camino de Santiago pilgrimage back. And when I say dedicated, I mean getting in a car, getting some road paint from the yellow road paint from the Department of Roadworks, like begging them to give him an extra bucket or two, and driving, getting out along the route and painting arrow signs on the rocks to remark the pilgrimage route for walkers and make it possible for people to find their way all these hundreds of kilometers toward Santiago de Compostela. And he doesn't just go and physically, remark the way, but he's involved in conferences. He gets involved with the Pope directly. He tries to get as much high-level support from the UN kind of World Heritage and from the Pope to recognize that this pilgrimage represents a really significant piece of our history and culture, and that it's something worth recognizing and preserving. So he works with this single-minded, persistent effort for the rest of his life. And you see the numbers bounce back as a direct result. So even in his lifetime, and I think he dies in the late 90s or early 2000s, the numbers have gone from a handful to a few thousand. And now hundreds of thousands of people make this journey every year. So if you're looking at a pilgrimage that was nearly vanished in the 1970s, and now we're looking at some 50 years later, and it's as large as it was in its heyday and possibly larger, that is astonishing.
Do you think the impact of kind of modern society where we can never disconnect also influences just how many people have embraced the Camino? Like I meet people who have never done a walking holiday, never slept outside, never camped. And, they go and do a Camino, and people who are not outdoorsy at all. But there's something that draws people. And do you think that maybe that's changed from, the 1970s where people maybe still spent lots of time outside and weren't always on their phones or, you know, sending and receiving emails?
That's a really interesting point. I think there's something very, very compelling about the experience that has always been very compelling. And then there's an additional factor which you're saying. But to start with the first thing, I think that the experience of leaving your home and going on the Camino involves leaving behind all the roles that you normally play and all of the things you normally spend your time and energy on. Maybe at home you're a parent, you're an employee, you have, this thing and that thing to worry about. And when you adventure on this Camino, you're just a pilgrim suddenly. And you're just like every other pilgrim doing this route. There's a much stronger sense of the shared experience rather than all the things that make us different as people. And that is a very attractive and powerful experience to have. And then there's the act of actually walking itself, walking for hours, all day across a landscape. You experience it in a very different way from if you're cycling or driving or flying over it. You notice things. You have the chance to stop and look at the roadside flower or the cow that has come to the fence to say hello to you. You can stop and enjoy that cow for 10 minutes. It's not like, oh, look, there's a cow and we're off in the car. So there's a slowing down of everything. There's an appreciation of exactly where you are, and there's a lack of distraction by all the other things. And as you point out, I think that living as we do now in the age of the internet and smartphones, we're more than ever bombarded with everything except where we are and what we're doing. We're constantly distracted by looking at our phones and flicking from one thing to the other, from things around the world, funny things, awful things, absolutely sickening things, shocking things, things that aren't even true, and we're just bombarded by all these things all the time to the point where we've become quite oblivious to who we're sitting next to, what's going on around us, even how we feel in our own bodies. We're just totally distracted. And so perhaps, as you suggest, the Camino exerts a stronger draw on us in the last couple of decades because it offers us a relief from that. It offers us a sense of quietness and a chance to hear ourselves think. And that, for many of us, is a new experience.
What do you think of the Camino used to only be done by people on a religious pilgrimage, and now, I'd say at least half, if not more, are not religious at all. Do you think people who aren't religious have a different experience? And if so, how do you think that experience might be different from someone who is, quite religious?
I think it's a very powerful experience, whether you're religious or not. And I think that obviously the way that you express the meaning of that experience to yourself and others, the vocabulary you use, will depend on whether you come from a religious background or not. But there's a lot of power in that experience, even without the theological component. And part of that is the meditative aspect of it. Part of it is the leveling of all the travelers as just pilgrims and the experiences you have with other people who are sharing that journey. It's so easy to have conversations with with other pilgrims on the road who are perfect strangers, but because it's very obvious that you're sharing this experience, you have an instant bridge where you can just begin a conversation, and pretty soon you're having these very warm, often very deep conversations with people that really make you think, and they they make you think about life, about your own life, about the experiences of other people. You're going to reflect on things in your own way, and you're going to come back from that with something you didn't have when you started out. And so what that thing is may look different for each person, and we may talk about it differently, but there's a reason why people are doing this in massive numbers, because it is profoundly rewarding. I remember a conversation like this I had with a pilgrim on the road. I was actually in Santiago, so the final destination city, and I'd seen the cathedral and I'd done all the things. And I stopped into a little cafe to have a coffee, and she was there. And it was pretty easy to spot because pilgrims, they have their backpacks and their walking shoes. So we struck up a conversation. And one of the very common questions people ask each other is, what got you on the Camino? And she had come from Germany. And she said to me, I lost a child 3 or 4 years ago. I lost my daughter, and she was quite young, I think under 10. And it was a very painful experience. And so I went on the Camino as a way of processing that grief for the first time in the wake of losing this child. And she said, I talked to other parents, and I ended up bringing with me a little pebble for my child and for all the other children or other parents that I talked to who were experiencing similar losses. And I walked with these little rocks in my backpack all the way to Spain, to the Santiago de Compostela, and then beyond to the actual shores of the Western Ocean, a place called Finisterre, where a lot of pilgrims will go to sort of extend their journey a little bit. And she said, on the shores of the ocean, I took out all of these rocks and I placed them there. And she talked about it as a very profound way of getting some closure on this loss and think about hers and that of other people. So here she was now doing the Camino again, but talking about this experience that had started her on that journey. And so you can't help but reflect on things like that when you have these experiences and people share these stories with you.
Wow, that's a powerful story and powerful imagery, just carrying all this grief for herself and for all their people like her. Um, I can almost imagine just how it felt to empty those rocks out, and it would bring a real strong sense of closure, or at least a diminution in the grief.
Yes.
Um, One question I had is, it's famous, the Camino de Santiago is famous for the seashell people put on their back. In French, it's a coquille Saint Jacques. I think it's just scallop shell in English. But
Yes.
what's the history of that? Is that something that's always been part of this, or is that a more recent invention?
Yes. So it has been part of the Camino for a very long time. It's sort of the symbol of that pilgrimage. And every major pilgrimage, there were three in the medieval world, Rome, Jerusalem, and Santiago. They all had their own symbol. So for Rome, it was a key, like the keys of St. Peter. For Jerusalem, it was a palm branch, and so Jerusalem pilgrims were called palmers. The ones who went to Rome were called roamers, and then the ones on the Camino were called peregrinos. But they had the scallop shell. The reason for the scallop shell is because legend says that the bones of St. James washed up on the beach and then miraculously made their way inland to Santiago de Compostela. So, this idea that the body of St. James was sort of in a boat without steering or a rudder that miraculously made its way to the shores of Spain. And then from there, the body goes inland by various means. The accounts vary. But that's where the seashell comes from. It's that beach part of the story.
You mentioned the other Caminos, and last year, my wife and I did the last 3 weeks of the Via Francigena from Florence to
Wow.
Rome. And what really hit us is there was nobody on there. So after doing the Camino Frances, where there are thousands of people every day, there was 13 people. And, some days you get a bit ahead of them. And so you might walk and not see any other pilgrims that day. Even with the different pilgrimages to Compostela, you have the Camino Frances that is very busy. You have the Via de la Plata, which is, very not busy until you get to the common ending bit. Why do you think different pilgrimages have become so much more popular than other ones when they all offer a really similar kind of, you're going through these beautiful rural towns, connecting with nature, meeting other pilgrims. Why is the Camino Frances so much more popular than all the other ones?
I think the answer to that is marketing and two major films. I mean, in terms of why it's taken hold of popular imagination in the 2000s, I think, there are two major films about it, and they're both about the Via Francese, I think. So that particular route to Santiago, although there are, as you say, many others, but once people see a vision of it, they want to have an experience that looks like that or is as close to that as possible. So I think it has always been a very well marketed pilgrimage. Even from the early days, like the word of this shrine in Spain traveled very quickly and it was very successful. But I think right now in the 2000s, I think these two films, and probably, I suspect, although I haven't gone and checked it out, earlier accounts, many accounts of people doing the Camino and that kind of being in the air in terms of walkers and nomads and the people who look at those message boards. There have been little books and things like that. So I'm sure that that's got a lot to do with it. The Via Francigena I want to do precisely because, as you say, it goes through some stunning terrain and it's far less trafficked. So I'm excited to hear more about that from you.
Yeah, it's brilliant, and it's funny you mentioned the marketing. I first heard of the Camino in Paulo Coelho's book, The Pilgrimage, and at that point, I must have been in high school, or I'd never done a walking holiday, and I just thought, oh wow, this sounds really cool. And I didn't even really know what it was, and it wasn't probably for another 10 years that I actually realized, oh, this is a real thing, like, we can do. This is not just something for, like, authors to do. And, yeah, it's incredible to think back, that was probably 30 years ago. Eva, it's been so great getting all this history, all this knowledge, from you. Thanks for sharing all your expertise and coming on the show today.
Well, it was an absolute pleasure, Richard. It's a wonderful subject. Pilgrimage is a fantastic experience. I highly recommend it to people, and it's a wonderful to talk to you about it.
If people want to, follow along, if they love history, where can they find your podcast, your YouTube channel, anything else like that?
Okay, so everything that I do historically is Villains and Virgins podcast, which is available as streaming audio wherever you listen, and it's also available as a video version on YouTube. I am on social media pretty much everywhere as Eva Schubert with an SCH. And if people are really interested in other less trafficked pilgrimages, I'm currently working on a historical tour in England, spring of 2026, which will involve a 3-day pilgrimage from London to Canterbury.
Oh,
So if you want
wow.
to dip your toes into pilgrimage, but you don't want to be gone for months, it's a 3-day walk. You can definitely send me a message on any of those platforms and I can forward that information as it's finalized.
That sounds epic. I'll put links to those in the show notes. And thanks everyone for listening to this episode of the 10 Adventures podcast. We'll be back next week to explore the world and hear about more epic adventures. Bye bye. Start planning your own adventure by visiting us at 10adventures.com and listen to other episodes of the 10 Adventures podcast on Amazon Music, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or anywhere else you find your podcasts.